Thanks for tuning into our podcast. We love having you here, and it's our mission to bring you all the latest and greatest tips, skills, and know-how to make you the best that you can be. We know that you have it in you, and we're going to show you how. Now, let's get started.
This is Omobola Stephen, the host of The Backstory with Omobola Stephen. On The Backstory, we like to focus on what has not worked and what will make it work, focusing on government and politics and other subtopics such as science and technology, government, the environment, society, and culture. Today, I have Irina Tsukerman, who is an human rights and national security lawyer and also a geopolitical analyst on The Backstory. Now she'll be talking about human rights and national security. Hi, Irina. Welcome to the show.
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
Happy to have you share your thoughts on this important topic for such a dynamic time as this. The question number one I'd like to ask us going forward is the US has frequently invoked national security as a justification for policies that violate human law. Now, we all know that. I'd like you to respond to this question. When does the state violate international law? And also in this scenario, what do you think thought states should do?
Well, international law is a very broad topic because there are many subdivisions. There are various conventions to which a state may or may not be a signatory. If they are a signatory or ratified appropriate treaties, the burden on them to follow those particular international agreements is higher than if they're not. That said, there are some issues that are fairly universal that any state is precluded from engaging, even if they're not a signatory to particular conventions. For instance, unjustified invasion of other countries, attacks, targeting of civilians during crisis. Things of that nature would not be justifiable even if there's no specific convention or the country is not privy to any particular agreement. And at that point, the international community, such as the United Nations, would be free to impose sanctions. But there is also a great room, with the exception of those fairly well-defined circumstances, there's a great room for disagreement. Some US scholars, for instance, legal scholars, believe that international law should play a part in a broader consideration of constitutional applications on particular issues. Others believe that US Constitution is paramount to anything external, and that while international agreements are necessary to coordinate between states, ultimately national interests trump all of these concerns. And also, essentially, international institutions which try to incorporate as many voices as possible tend to end up with very, very broad understandings of what international law is or should be. And essentially, a lot of the rights that are suggested basically come as a summary of assorted agreements, and they may not always be relevant applicant to everyone involved, and they're just going to be different priorities for what to consider more and less or less binding, important. Essentially, a lot of the international law is aspirational rather than binding in many of its applications.
All right, now, if we're talking about the state, how do you think states can be able to balance national security interests with human rights and freedoms, going by the rise of the terrorism that is happening around the globe?
As with any issue, there's always a balance between security and the individual rights and protections. Within the U.S., internally and domestically, these issues are fairly well defined by the Constitution. But when it's applied to foreign policy, that is a harder balance to strike. There is, in general, the direction of trying to protect civilians from harm, from unintentional harm, even at times of war, and to focus U.S. policy in a way that meets its direct threats rather than any general disagreements. Most disagreements should be settled in a peaceful political and diplomatic way or legal way through courts, through negotiations and diplomacy, and U.S. tries to place diplomacy and to minimize escalations of conflicts or involvement in direct and violent confrontations. But the biggest issue, of course, is how do you define threats, and when do you decide that the threat is sufficient that you utilize deadly force, and how do you minimize civilian casualties from being impacted by that? And furthermore, when it comes to counterterrorism specifically, there's always a very broad discussion whether terrorism is a military issue, whether it's a crime, or whether it's some third undefined category, and how to navigate those waters. If you bring terrorists back to the United States, if they're U.S. citizens, the issue is pretty clear. They're basically treated as any other citizen that has committed a crime. If they're not citizens, are they do they still fall under a regular criminal category? A political crime is still a crime, or should they be tried in military court as enemy combatants, or should they be or is their status not in either of those categories? Much of the national security and human rights concerns regarding the area of counterterrorism, especially in the shortly before and after 9/11, has been around this inability to clearly define terrorism. Normally, enemy combatants considered prisoners of war are subjected to Geneva Conventions, because most enemy prisoners of war, they wear a uniform, they subscribe to a straight doctrine, and states are generally signatories to the Geneva Conventions that prohibit torture, that focus on the reciprocity and humane and equitable treatment of prisoners and timely exchanges. But enemy combatants who are terrorists are not always state-sponsored. They're not always answerable to any particular country. They often may be civilian by day and combatants by night, and it's very hard to try or to figure out what to do with someone who does not prescribe to international law and who is fighting for a cause that is often disconnected from any official states that can be resolved politically or legally. So that has led to kind of a limbo in many of these cases, such as the Guantanamo base, where a lot of these people are held before it's decided what to do with them, whether to charge them criminally, whether to try them as enemy combatants, or whether to come to some sort of an agreement with the other countries and to expel them into those countries' custody, and basically say, you guys are not really a direct threat to us at the moment. Just go and let your home country or someone else decide how to treat you. You're not at present day a threat. So this has been a very complex dynamic because of this inability to create a separate legal category for non-civilian and non-state affiliated enemy combatants, and what to do with them, whether to treat them as a military matter, as a civilian matter, or whether some third category applies to them, because then it's a different set of rules, different set of rights, different set of responsibilities when it comes to their treatment.
Irina, large-scale surveillance by the National Security Agency is hampering the ability of journalists and lawyers to do their work. Now, this is corroding U.S. democracy. How do you think we can right it wrong?
There's a huge understanding about NSA and rights, because what NSA does is collect information. It doesn't make policy. It very frequently does not have the ability to analyze the information it gathers, and therefore it is not ultimately responsible for what happens with that information. Some people argue that the very collection of data violates the right to privacy, which, by the way, has also been very poorly defined by the Constitution. We've seen what happened with Roe versus Wade. It was essentially very limited by the court, and that's not delving into the rights concerning data that was simply mostly focused on abortion issues. When it comes to data-related rights, we have yet to have that political reckoning. But NSA itself is merely a collector. What happens next is a matter of legal and political decision making, and those are the issues. It's not the collection agencies that are a concern. It's the laws that are governing the limits that can be placed on this level of collection. The Patriot Act has rightfully been at the center of a great deal of controversy, precisely because it has been seen as overly broad. And while the initial need for it was directly in response to 9/11, after that it has become entrenched well beyond its initial use and necessity, and has essentially swept in a lot of issues that may not be directly related to security and to immediate security needs. So that's one of the controversies that's rightfully being debated, but is very unlikely to be politically overturned in the near future. Has not been at the priority of the lawmakers in since its passage.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts, Irina. You are a geopolitical analyst. Now, going forward, I'd like you to talk about the important geopolitical issues. Now, talking about the geopolitical aspects of the U.S. political divide. Like, let's talk about the major issue of inflation and climate change. Do you think the U.S. is politically stable enough to control its biggest problem?
Honestly, I think inflation is the one issue that unites rather than divides Americans. I think most Americans feel the brunt of the inflation and they agree that it's a problem. The problem is in agreeing what should be cut in order to control inflation, because there's an assortment of major entitlement programs that have been consistent causes of inflation and yet have been popular enough that neither side could really make a cut. The Democrats generally tend to lean towards cutting defense-related spending. The Republicans tend to focus more on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, but neither side has really succeeded in cutting costs. If anything, they've grown. Actually, both sides have been very much promoting inflation in their spending. But outside these fairly consistent programs that have been around for decades and have been have been debated without any much program, more recent spending allegedly towards climate change and energy related matters such as the Inflation Reduction Act have also been widely criticized by both parties because they have been overbroad, included many unrelated spending projects, basically pork barreling taken to an extreme, and have not been narrowly tailored to ensure that their implementation can be successful without the money being lost in the process. Basically, what happens in the process of trying to implement these acts, you have, this a huge federal spending package that's supposed to go down to various federal and then local institutions, but these institutions are not prepared to accept the money for the spending because they don't have all the people in place to actually implement the programs. They don't have the plan for any specific programs, and they don't have any expertise in implementing them. They haven't even identified the issues that should be spent on. So you get all this money, you're required by law to spend it, and you have no way to do it. So what do? Usually nothing, actually. Most of the time that money ends up being frozen in limbo until the next controller of the house decides whether to retake that money and reallocate it somewhere else or not, which is likely what's going to happen with a huge chunk of it. So that's how you end up with inflation, when you have poorly defined bills that are very vague, very broad. They mean well, but there's really no way to actually spend all that money at the same time all over the country the way it was meant to be, because it's simply the infrastructure for this is not there. So you basically put the carriage before the horse when you pass bills like that. Before you start passing bills saying, oh, well, we should do this and that, you should ask yourself, what do we have in place to make sure that this actually happens? So that is a cause of a lot of the inflation, and I think both parties would agree with that. even so where they would disagree is the issue of climate change, but not for the reasons one might expect. Both Republicans and Democrats believe in protecting the environment. If you ask any Republican, no Republican will tell you, I don't care about planet Earth and I want to live in a polluted, horrible space. No one will actually say that. What they do differ is the method of evaluating what constitutes a threat, how much of it is controllable by human being, how much has it worked efficiently, and what needs to be done and how. So I think that's where the majority of the agreement has been. The climate change rhetoric has been a bit apocalyptical, and people are skeptical because it has been apocalyptical not today, not yesterday, but for decades without the sort of catastrophic critical outcomes that have been predicted since basically at least the 60s to this day. At times it was called global cooling, at times it was called global warming, now it's called more generic climate change, but the issue is the same. Is the damage to the environment so catastrophic that it affects life in a way that is unmanageable and will lead to its extinction? The answer is no, and frankly, that sort of rhetoric is not helpful to getting practical measures passed. It actually turns off a lot of people because they simply don't believe it. It's like a boy cries wolf scenario. But there's also the issue of measuring this environmental impact. A lot of the Democrats have been focused on decarbonization process and computer modeling in measuring these concerns. The Republicans have been skeptical of the computer models precisely because they're models, they're very theoretical, and there's no clear way right now to measure the environmental impact of human activity through experiments that are replicable and adhere to the scientific method. So that's where a lot of the skepticism comes from. But when it comes to other issues, such as protecting biodiversity, such as having, such as essentially energy, creating more cleaner and efficient energy, there is really no daylight. I think the Republicans are very much for innovation and for entrepreneurship and for having more efficient, cleaner energy and not being dependent on foreign sources of energy. They just don't like government mandating very arbitrary figures that are then impossible for businesses and for individuals to keep up with. They basically believe that a lot of this environmental regulation can come from private initiatives, and it does, by the way, very voluntarily, because there is good money in that. It is a very growing and vibrant industry. There's a lot of room for optimism about innovation. We've made a lot of breakthroughs for the past several decades, and it's expected to be the same. But the Republicans don't want these initiatives to affect and increase inflation and to cause additional burdens on the taxpayers, which some of these excessive regulations cause. And a lot of the industries are also kind of jumping on the bandwagon and funding things without really looking at whether they're even asking the right questions. So you have this general good intention, general concern about doing the best thing, but a lot of disagreement on how to get there in a way that does not cause as much damage as it tries to kind of prevent.
Right. Irina, human rights and the role of NGOs. Right to this, right to that. Now we all know about that. Sometimes the dignity of the individual citizens may be threatened by the power of the state. I'm sure you have to with me on this. Now, the NGOs play a crucial role in this regard, but really, the issue seems not to be abating. Let's talk about the role of the NGOs in terms of human rights activism.
Sure. So NGOs actually, as a model, NGOs are very, in theory, they have a powerful and important role to play in focusing on different issues and bringing human rights abuses to to the fore of discussion, to media awareness, to public awareness, to government, and pushing and pressuring governments on doing the right thing. So in theory, NGOs have a very important part to play, and when governments start cracking down on them, that's generally a bad sign, because if governments should not be afraid of challenging, of criticism, even if it's incorrect criticism. They should be able to take it on, challenge it, answer it. The problem is, however, is that a lot of NGO funding, not just human rights, any NGO funding on any nonprofit issue can become corrupt, because first of all, it's human nature to sometimes abuse its own power, and human nature is sometimes to be greedy. Not always, but when there's no regulatory framework in place, when there's no right internal culture in place, when there are no safeguards, and when these NGOs are themselves nearly immune from any sort of accountability, what happens is they can become as self-selecting and as corrupt as any government, really. And they play this major role in institutions because you have these giant legacy institutions built up, and so if you have smaller alternatives that are trying to focus on narrow issues and to be more accountable, they sometimes don't survive financially, because there's already so much with these huge conglomerates. And essentially NGOs can become channels for funneling funding by the very governments that should be examined and criticized into suppressing narratives they don't like and promoting narratives that serve their agenda under the guise of human rights. So that's where we need to be very careful. Yes, the role of NGOs is in general important, but second, you need to be careful where you get your sources from. You have to be critical in any reports coming from any human rights, because incorrect misreporting of information or fabrications or politicizing this issue actually undermines it. It makes it harder to push the governments, because they can just dismiss any reporting from NGO as fabrications and nonsense and political agenda just because somebody does it.
Right. Now, still talking about human rights, how can we uphold civil and human rights in the implementation of national security policies?
I think a lot of it is about dialogue, but also leverage. The countries like the US have a lot of leverage, but they don't in pushing their allies and their adversaries in the right direction, but they don't always exercise it wisely. So when you try to do everything at once, you end up doing nothing at all, which is what happens a lot of the time, not out of not caring enough, not out of some sort of a cynical, manipulative agenda because we enjoy abusing human rights. No, it's the issue of just simply lack of focus, lack of understanding the cultures of the countries we're dealing with and how to make your point effectively. And we have seen that in the past, US has been quite effective in certain instances in enforcing our friends to do the right thing. President Kennedy famously basically got Saudi Arabia to drop slavery back in the 60s, but he did that not through threatening sanctions in public or starting media campaigns. He did it by having credibility, by having strong relationships, and by basically pushing it behind the scenes, but also offering a more positive US response as an incentive to do the right thing. We seem to have lost that art of conversation and of dialogue, and we also get another issue is with more adversarial countries, we tend to kind of ignore the issue or focus on other things until it becomes too late. And when we wake up and start trying to do the right thing as sanctions, as congressional matter, as investigative matters, at that point it's very hard to move the situation anywhere. I just give you an example of Russia. I mean, now there's a war in Ukraine, so everybody's up in arms about it. But in fact, Russia has been sliding down human rights hill for decades internally before it became a real problem once again. And there's been warning signs since 2008 when it entered Georgia, and we failed to do anything, and we failed to curtail the problem before it really got out of hand, and we really didn't do much about human rights situations inside Russia. And to this day, there's a lot of focus on particular opposition groups and an exclusion of others. So if you really want to promote human rights, you need to be hearing from everybody and not just pick favorites that have the biggest platform or shout the loudest or sound the most similar to your perspectives. That's been our mistake consistently when dealing with various countries around the world, and that's how a lot of minority voices, a lot of ethnic religious minorities end up being underrepresented at the table, and we end up crafting policies or pushing policies that are one-sided and not necessarily beneficial.
Thanks so much, Irina Tsukerman, for sharing your thoughts and talking about women freedom. That's also very important for us. Do you have any projects you'd like to share with my audience or any interesting news? We'll be looking forward to listening to that.
Well, my biggest thing right now is investigating some of the abuses of digital rights framework by adversarial states, surveillance states like China and Russia that don't actually place a lot of value on privacy or individual rights or anything like that, have intelligently co-opted the existing framework and have exploited the goodwill and the naivete and over-reliance on human rights NGOs by Western countries and other countries to essentially push agendas that are detrimental. Rather than focusing on human rights, they focus on particular softwares that they don't like and can't get, and basically on disarming their enemies rather than protecting human rights around the world. So this sort of issue, these sort of frameworks have become co-opted by a number of major NGOs that don't particularly look into where their funding is coming from very carefully and don't ask questions. How is it that always the usual suspects come up, but states that are, at the top of human rights abuse agenda, they're never quite criticized with the same level of pushback. So we need to be careful with that, and I think a lot of Western countries have fallen for media campaigns and have forgotten that media campaigns and scandals are a favorite way of our adversaries of authoritarian regimes to kind of use propaganda as a means of distracting from their own abuses and kind of making us feel bad and want to do something, but misdirecting our efforts into the wrong targets. And we should want to do something, but that should include careful investigation. It should not be relying on suspicious sources to push information under our noses. We should be critically thinking about every information that comes our way, whether about human rights abuses or threats or anything else, and then doing our own work, doing our own evaluations and asking tough questions and allocating resources towards those investigations and making sure that we're not being co-opted and manipulated and directed away from where we can make a difference.
Irina, we'd like to learn more about you. Can you share your website and your social media handles?
Absolutely. So I can be found on LinkedIn and Facebook. I'm very active on LinkedIn. It's a great professional website for connecting with people who are focused on those issues. Additionally, I have my legal practice. It's called Irina Tsukerman's National Security Boutique Law Firm. You can just Google that and find it. I have Scarab Rising is my strategic advisory, which I mentioned previously, Scarab Rising Inc. There's also the Washington Outsider, where I try to post articles by various voices on issues that don't attract a lot of attention or are not introduced well. For now, I've been talking a lot about security issues in West Africa, for instance. I have a number of contributors on that issue, although it varies based on what's going on. And there's also my YouTube channel where you can find my videos, both my own personal discussions and media appearances, and the Washington Outsider Report, my podcast, video podcast that appears on the Coalition Radio. The programs air live Tuesday nights at 9. They're pre-recorded mostly, but they air Tuesday nights, and you can find them consequently on YouTube, and I share them on my channel as well.
Irina, you must have a lot on your plates. Good to know. Thanks for sharing that to us.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
All right. Thank you so much also for joining me on today's show on the Backstory with Omobola Stephen. I really want to appreciate your time and sharing your thoughts on today's show, talking about national security and human rights. I really wish you best of luck once again on the projects that you're embarking upon.
Thank you so much, and best of luck to you as well.
All right. Now, if you'd like to catch up with any missed episodes of the Backstory with Omobola Stephen, you can do so on any cross-promotion platforms or any podcast distribution platforms you bump into online. And you have a great time listening to experts and professionals share their thoughts on topics on the government and politics, and also on science and technology, society and culture, and the environment. I need you to stay safe at Aston.
Thank you.